Thank you, Susie. Good morning, everybody. My name's Mike, and we're glad you're here. There's a story we looked at in the book of Mark, a couple of months ago, that I want to refer to. Mark chapter 3, verse 1, another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of the religious leadership, were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal the man on the Sabbath. You were allowed to heal on the Sabbath if someone's life was in danger. A man with a shriveled hand, that was not life-threatening. So technically, Jesus was not allowed by the religious authorities. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. Jesus looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. Now, these words are interesting. Who is Pastor Mike Erre? Does that actually say that? Edwin, you are fired. You are hired. The two words that we translate anger and deeply distressed, I want to show them to you. The first one is when it says that Jesus is angry, it's the word orge. There are different Greek words for anger. This one means a settled disposition against something. It's not flying off the handle. It's not impulsive anger. It is every time you come into contact with this thing, you are opposed to it every single time. It's not something that Jesus does. It's something that Jesus is. Jesus is opposed to whatever it is that he's seeing. The second word, which I'm not going to pronounce, means to be moved with grief. And so here Jesus is. He sees this image of religious leaders looking to find fault in Jesus for healing a man on the Sabbath. And he looks around at them and it says he is angry, but not impulsively angry, and he's grieving. And that combination of anger and grief has been the best word, those have been the best words I've found to describe what this week was like for a lot of us. My son Seth has special needs. He comes home from his middle school on Wednesday, uttering a phrase I've not heard him say, lockdown drill. And, as a parent, you just sort of imagine your child in a situation like that. I don't even know that Seth would know what's going on. He would think it was fireworks or something. And my wife teaches at a small Christian school. My daughter attends a small Christian school not far away from where all of this happened. So I was rummaging around for a way to describe how I was feeling, and I came across these words: anger mixed with grief, or grief mixed with anger. And it seemed appropriate that we would take a little time this morning to talk about grief and to talk about anger. So just a word about grief. There's a very famous memory verse in the book of John that consists of two words. Jesus wept. And I want to frame that phrase in the story that holds it, because I think there's something in there that's super instructive for us. John 11, verse 17, Jesus is very close to a family, Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus. Jesus finds out that Lazarus is sick unto death. And it says that Jesus waits. He could have rushed there, but he waited until Lazarus died. On Jesus' arrival, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. That number is significant because there was a mystical tradition in those days that the body of someone would hover, the spirit of someone would hover over their body when they were dead. And if you were so empowered, you could actually bring about resurrection within 3 days. 4 days, though, resurrection was impossible unless you were God. So the significance of the time marker is that Jesus has waited strategically till 4 days has elapsed. Bethany, which is a village name, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. Now, we've talked about this before, but there's a Jewish mourning practice, grieving practice, that is still practiced today. It's called sitting Shiva or Shiva. You have to be very careful how to pronounce that. But sitting Shiva is a way in which, and the Shiva I think meant 7, and it was a way in which the Jewish community would come into the house of a bereaved person and family and just be present with them for 7 days. They would only act in response to the action of the bereaved. If the bereaved wanted to talk, they would talk. If the bereaved was weeping, they would weep. They took care of all the household chores, and for 7 days they were just present so that that person and that family was never alone. There were actually people who were hired to be professional mourners, who would actually give words and anguish to the emotion that sometimes bereaved people couldn't express themselves. So this is the setting where Jesus arrives outside of this village. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. And the reason that's significant is she's at home with all of these mourners. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And we all resonate with a question like that, right? You're good and you're powerful and you could stop all this nonsense, and you don't. But then she quotes the religious cliche, but I know that even now that God will give you whatever you ask. Hint, hint. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And she said, I know that he will rise again to the general resurrection far into the future. Jesus said, but I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, I believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God who is here and has come into the world. After she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and said, the teacher's here, is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now, Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him, when the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her. Now we know what that comforting looks like. When they noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her. Their job was to do whatever the mourner was doing. So she got up and rushed out of the house. They got up and rushed out of the house. And she says the same thing that her sister says. Lord, if you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews that had come along with her weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? Come and see, Lord, they replied. And then it says, Jesus wept. What's interesting, and you don't pick this up in English, is that the weeping of the Jews and the weeping of Mary, there's one word to describe that. But the weeping of Jesus, there's a different word that's used. It's the weeping of the Jews was this almost like public grief that you would have. But the weeping of Jesus was this private sadness. And even though we joke around how that's the shortest verse to memorize, the fact that Jesus has just told her he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and he still wept, holds a profound truth for us. Like, Jesus' power didn't cancel out his sorrow. His ability, he was going to heal Lazarus in what, 10 minutes? And that didn't preclude his agony. So there's just this thing in Christian circles where somehow we've all decided we have to be polite in our grieving. And we know hope is out there, and so we just deal often with grief by slapping a religious cliche on something. And Jesus didn't do that. He said, I'm going to raise Lazarus, just so you know, and he still wept. So we can know all the great religious theory about life after death and have the great faith that Jesus had and still come across situations where the only proper thing to do is to grieve. And there's a whole tradition in the Old Testament of grieving well that Americans typically aren't familiar with. Right? We like our church services ending on an up note, on a positive note, on an encouraging note with a nice red bow. But there's so many parts of the Bible that don't resolve. They just sit there in rawness and in honesty. It's the tradition of lament. And so many of us need to be reminded we have permission in moments like these to feel what we're feeling and to not have to clean that up to bring it to God. Lament is different than complaining. Lament assumes the covenant goodness of God and God's willingness to help human beings. And lament brings and names what is out of order into that space. And so I just want to read a couple of examples of lament to remind us that we're not supposed to get cleaned up, that faith in Jesus, even in the resurrection, doesn't rule out the grief and the despair or the fear. Psalm 137 was written by the Jews in Babylon. So they had been exiled from their homeland into Babylon. And this image of all the musicians that would play their instruments in worship to God in Jerusalem, now being mocked to sing in Babylon. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and we wept when we remembered Jerusalem. There on the trees we hung our harps. What an image. There's nothing to sing, so we put our instruments away. For there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of the songs of Jerusalem. But how can we sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. That's not resolved. That's not cleaned up. Like there are people here who've hung their harps today and just said, enough. I don't know what to do. Lament, go ahead, put that up, Dave, if you would, the next quote. Lament is not just expressing emotion, but it names what is in the way of humans thriving. Simple acts of lament expose the conditions that prevent human thriving and names them and makes them visible for remedy. Lament is the fierce and fearless naming of what is wrong in God's world. Psalm 43. And you realize that prayer isn't a place to be good, it's a place to be honest. Vindicate me, my God, and plead my cause against an unfaithful nation. Rescue me from those who are deceitful and wicked. You, God, are my stronghold. Why have you rejected me? Why must I go around mourning, oppressed by the enemy? Send me your light and your faithful care, and let those lead me. Let them bring me to your holy mountain, to the place where you dwell. Then I will go to the altar to praise you. I will praise you with my musical instruments, O God, my God. But why is my soul so downcast? Why is it so disturbed in me? Next slide. The laments are refusals to settle for the way that things are. They are acts of relentless hope that believe no situation falls outside of Yahweh's capacity for transformation. Habakkuk 1. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out violence, and you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate doing wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore, the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. Lament assumes the goodness of God and then says, here's what is out of order. Next slide. Lament is not, and this is so important, a replacement for action. Lament precedes action. Lament in the Christian tradition is that form of prayer that allows us to sum up the pain of the earth and bring it to heaven's gates. Lament is a form of biblical protest. And so for some of us, and not all of us are in this place, of course. Some of us are, like me, I'm numb. I'm numb to these sorts of tragedies. But until something happens this close, where I can imagine my family being at risk, then it matters. I hate that. I hate that. And there's this impulse in Christian circles just to wrap a bow on it, and there's no bow. There's no bow. So we just sit. So lament is that space where we're just really honest, and we don't feel like we have to pretend and clean it up. But that's not the only thing that Jesus was feeling in that moment in Mark. Right? It was grief, but there was anger. So let's talk about anger for a second. Back to Mark. When we last left Jesus, he was looking around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. He said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and the man's hand was completely restored. Some of us have a picture that anger is always and universally negative. And so it's tough to reconcile an angry Jesus to that picture. The nice thing, in a way, is that the Bible makes lots of room for angry Jesus. But I want to ask two questions that confront me and us. What does Jesus get mad at as opposed to what do I get mad at? And then what does Jesus do with his anger as opposed to what do I do with mine? So what does Jesus get mad at? Injustice in a very specific way. Describe it just real quick. Missing the point entirely. Claiming religious abstraction against the man who needs healing. And Jesus looks at them in anger mixed with grief. And then what does he do with his anger? He heals the man. He heals the man. What do I do with mine? I break things. And that's through yelling and other forms. And so you get this image of Jesus in a situation where there's anger mixed with grief. And for me, that just captures perfectly what I've been feeling. And I think a lot of us maybe feel. And this isn't the only time Jesus gets angry. Later on in Mark, and we've looked at each of these stories, people were bringing little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them. But the disciples rebuked those people. When Jesus saw the disciples rebuking people bringing little children to Jesus, what was he? Indignant. Is that a happy word? Nope. He said, "Let the little children come to me, do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these." Verse 16, and he took the children in his arms, placed his hands on them, and what? So, what caused Jesus to be angry? A similar thing, right? The injustice of holding children back in the name of protecting the mighty rabbi. And what does Jesus do with his anger? He blesses. Or one last example, on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. Now, Jesus doesn't injure anybody or anything. In fact, he's teaching while he's doing this. He overturned the tables of money changers and the benches of those selling doves. He would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts, and he taught them, "My house will be a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of robbers." And remember, den of robbers in an image from Jeremiah where people would hide in the temple thinking they were blessed by God when they were corrupt and full of malice towards others, and they just thought because they were in the temple they were safe. And so what does Jesus do in response to that? He symbolically judges the temple, sets it, he shuts it down for a little bit, and then, literally in the next episode, he presents himself as the new temple. So when we talk about anger is fuel. I can be totally exhausted and then something makes me angry and I got energy all day. When my kids were little, this was one of the dumber things. There's a big list. My wife was waiting to pull out of into an intersection, and for some reason, the accelerator didn't work, and so I was about to turn to her and say, hey, babe, it's green, go ahead. Because Lord knows you can't sit there for 5 seconds without moving. And this truck barreled down, going 50, 60 miles an hour through the red light. It would have destroyed us entirely, snuffed us out. And instead of being grateful in that moment, I was enraged. And so, like you do, I hopped out of the minivan and I started chasing the truck down the street. And there were a couple of things I learned in that moment. Number one, flip-flops are not helpful implements of speed. And then the second thing that started creeping into my head is, what exactly was I going to do when I caught them? And as it turned out, there was a stoplight. I was catching up. I took my flip-flops off to throw them in protest at the truck, and it sped away before I could register my displeasure. But it always just strikes me that anger is such a curious thing. It energizes, almost beyond our capacity to regulate. And when we see Jesus, far too many of us are angry about little and petty things because there hasn't been something beautiful that's captured our anger. And Susie and I are people that are in touch with such feelings. And a mentor of hers, or a friend, just said something that I think is so profound. There's a difference between being angry at something and being angry for something. Like being angry at, right? I want to punish, I want to blame, I want to scapegoat. Being angry for takes personalities out of it and causes me to fight for a state of affairs where my son doesn't have to learn the phrase lockdown drill. Yeah, Susie just wants you to know, and it was only her, she had to move from angry at to angry for. And we're still not quite sure she's arrived. No. So on the one hand, lament can often be thought to just be an excuse for passivity. Well, evil's always going to be with us. There's nothing we can do. Let's just pray. And I believe prayer does things in the world. Absolutely. So let's not doing nothing. But I also believe, as the movie Oh God, Part 1 says, none of you will know this movie. It's George Burns and John Denver. Late 70s, George Burns was like 98 at the time, and he's playing God. John Denver, country music artist, somehow got a role in this movie. John Denver looks at God, played by George Burns, and says, "Why do you allow war?" George Burns looks back and says, "Well, why do you? Why do you allow it?" See, God's sovereignty in the Bible is meant to be manifested through his image bearers, not around them. And so as we all sit today in the rawness or apathy of what we're looking at yet again, the invitation is that we grieve. Absolutely. And that we don't clean it up, and we don't make it nice, or have to be polite and just use religious words. And the invitation is that our anger might lead to blessing and healing rather than more fracture. I don't know if this story is true, but like good stories, there's truth in it. But I'd heard years ago about a village in Austria, and how many great stories begin with "there was a village in Austria." And supposedly in this village, when a family lost a family member, the village would gather in that home, and they would sing that person through the night. And if that person rested or slept for any amount of time, they would each go back into their homes and move something and change something in their homes, so that when the bereaved person woke up, they saw that the entire village knew that things were now never going back to the way that they were. And they had made symbolic changes to the way things looked in recognition of that fact. And for those of you who lost people, it's the weirdest thing. Your whole world has collapsed, and yet everything else is just going along like nothing changes. And so part of what we want to do today is witness to each other's grief. And we're going to take communion in a different way with people saying this is the body and this is the blood, and they're prayer people, but we still want to do questions. And I have to say, because things are so tender right now, be really cognizant of who else is in the room when you ask or talk. Right? We don't want to get into policies. We want to talk about us and how it is that we're to respond as Jesus people. So there's a text line if you want. And we really wrestled with this. Like, do we want to open it up? And there were so many in the first service. Like, yeah, if we don't talk about stuff like this, then what's the point of talking about anything? And we want this to be a safe place. So if you're here and you have views of the Second Amendment, and you're here and you have differing views of the Second Amendment, we're here because we both share in the body and blood of Jesus. If you're here and you want to find a scapegoat for this, and you're here and you think that is totally inappropriate, we share in the body and blood of Jesus. So let's talk, but let's talk very gently with each other today, shall we? Anything you want to ask or talk about?
Hi, I just have a question around hope.
Yeah.
How do we find still hope in this? Because when I think about civilization, it just seems like we haven't moved forward at all. We look back at ancient civilizations and judge them for sacrificing their children on altars, and yet here we are still doing the same thing.
Right.
You know, thousands of years later. How do we find hope that humanity can move forward and things can change? Because if we don't have that hope, then it kind of stops us from really taking any action.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to me, the New Testament has good news and bad news for that. Right? The bad news is, hey, guess what? Everyone's fallen. No one escapes that. And so everything that human beings create to deal with evil will itself be corrupted if not careful. That's why, according to the New Testament moral logic, that human beings are to live in something called the now and the not yet. So we'll talk about this next week on Easter, where Jesus provides some sort of like dramatic victory over all the powers and the principalities. And that's a true victory that happened then and carries forward to now. But it's not yet fully manifest on the earth yet. And so we're to be people who grieve, but not as those who have no hope. So on the one hand, we all recognize that human fallenness is a massive issue. And that's why it is that we yearn for, Jesus to come and fix the place. But like I was saying earlier, that doesn't remove, and your point I think is really insightful, the obligation that the church has as the people of the future living in the present to do the work of moral imagination required so that we can conceive of other ways of dealing with our problems than either do nothing or just more violence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a struggle because we're supposed to be bringing shalom. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I hear what you're saying, right? Like perfect shalom's not going to happen right now, but we're supposed to be bringing shalom, and it's just
Yes.
hard to know how to do that when it feels like we just can't move forward.
Yeah.
And the Bible to me is so clear that Jesus was always for the minority,
Yeah.
for the widow, for the poor, for
Right.
the children, and that's who we should be protecting as,
Right.
as a church body. Like, that's
Yeah.
who we should be for.
Absolutely.
But I don't know, it feels like we're stuck. I don't know. This week has been a tough week.
Yeah.
Just feeling like we're stuck as a civilization.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I don't know that I have a great answer. I just know as new creation people, we're not allowed to just be passive. There are certain views of how the world ends that says, hey, it's just going to get worse, and fighting against the worstness of the world is just rearranging seats on the Titanic as it's going down, and that's just not the posture of the New Testament. The posture is that the church is the church. The issue for me, and I don't know how this will hit you, I spend a lot of time worrying about all the people out there. And the consistent invitation of Jesus to me is, how am I bearing shalom? And if we have a bunch of people who are committed to shalom bearing who gather, perhaps then larger cultural dynamics can be addressed. But it seems, I don't know if this is true, but it seems like in the history of the church, shalom bearing has been often considered optional. And so often the church just lives and represents a mere image of the world to the world instead of a counter narrative of shalom. So I think you're absolutely right. I don't have a great answer. Of course, Susie.
I totally feel the same way as you. I just want to say that right off the bat before I offer this other piece. I think that sometimes, like, we can get really stuck in that, like, despair of, like, nothing's changing, it's all the same, it's been this way for centuries, people are dumb, like, all the things. But I think that there is, like, let's not despise the fact that we've been invited into community as a body, and, like, there are little things that we can do that bring a tremendous amount of hope to people, like sitting Shiva with someone, or just hearing them be angry, or bringing a loaf of bread to somebody, or inviting someone to the table to eat with you. Like, I have somebody who needs to make ham sliders tomorrow for one of the memorial services. Like, we can do that. Those are like little things that we can do, and they're not the big things, and the big things are really important, and I just want to emphasize that I think those are important, and we should still be praying towards that and bringing shalom in those big ways. But let's also remember that there are these really small ways that we're invited into, and you can bring a tremendous amount of hope to one person that can really change things.
That's great.
Don't minimize it.
Someone right behind you. Oh, Sam, go
We
ahead.
got one over here, Mike.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for asking the question. First of all, I think that's a really important one because we can't really offer hope if we don't have it in ourselves.
Yeah.
And for me personally, this week has looked like quieting and literally seeing the face of Jesus in front of me in my imagination. And I've sensed him saying, if you keep my face closer to you than the rest of the problems, I will be stronger. My shalom will come to you because you'll see my face. And I can attune with you, Tony. I can love you. I can fill you with what you don't even understand, right? And
Yeah.
I can ask you the hard questions, and you can ask me the hard questions.
Yeah.
But I don't think the church culture in the last 30 years has been good at teaching us to actually feel the live, living presence of God streaming to us in these moments. But that's what will fuel us. So I would love to see more of that type of relationship being shared between us, of how does God meet you like this,
Yeah.
so that you are filled with that hope to go offer even though you're grieving.
Yeah.
That's because that's our power, that's our source. It's not just the Bible, it's the active living presence of Jesus Christ right here in my face, attuning with me and saying, I got this. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm grieving with you, but there's hope, and you don't understand it yet, but just borrow my hope for now, right?
Yeah.
And that gives us what we need.
Thank you.
I think I've been struggling with how to take action and also not get in the way. And as someone that didn't want to sit in their house that day, like I was pulled over on the side of the road as the first responders were going by because I was on my way to my son's school that was a mile away. And there was that moment, like, I want to chase after and help, and at the same time you want to get out of the way. And so I think with sitting Shiva, the beautiful thing about that is that we're part of the same temple, we're part of the same community, we're part of the neighborhood. But if we're not, I feel like so many of us are just far enough removed that I want to take action, and yet I don't want to get in the way. I went to a prayer vigil, but I don't want to be on Harding because I don't want to get in the way of the people that need to be on Harding or that need the first responders. And I think as much in some ways I'm thankful that the news cycle has moved off of just standing outside of the Covenant School and just taking up space. I'm grieving for the families that in 3 months, this is still going to be very real to them.
Yeah.
And yet there's going to be something else on the news.
That's
and so I just wonder, I appreciate you having this conversation, but my heart wants to physically do something. And so what can we do as a church?
Yeah.
Well, and this person online said, I resonate with taking action after lament. It seems that we Christians expect God to stop these shootings, and he's not stopping them. He does not stop them, and they continue to happen. And so the only way to stop them seems to be for us to stop it. That is our responsibility in this world. So let's stop hiding behind waiting for God to fix it. We need to fix it. And can the church actually help lead the way as a voice in the wilderness and say what needs to be said?
Oh, what a wonderful point. I have nothing to add to that. That's fantastic.
We got one back here, Mike.
Hold on, JJ. We'll get to you next.
Sorry. My question would be, how do we deal with, or is there healthy ways to deal with being desensitized to all of this? Like, it happens so often.
So good.
Most of us are like just one step removed from all of it, and we care, we do, but since it's like, oh, that's not my life, how do we properly still grieve when we feel like it's like every other day? Like when they put out the numbers on the news, this thing that happened in our city is so close to home, but this is the umpteenth time that it's happened this year already, and we're only 3 months in. Like, how do we healthily deal with that desensitization?
Oh, thank you.
Dealing with so much of that.
Yes. Man, that is such a profound question. And I don't know. I mean, the human soul is not meant to be bombarded with the news, the images, and the opinions that we are hundreds of times daily. Our souls aren't built for that. Our souls are built for kinship groups where we care deeply about what happens to those who are close. I have no idea. I mean, I've been really wrestling with my relationship to social media. I don't do a lot of it, but I watch a lot of, that's how I get news, is Twitter, because I'm a Gen Xer. And I don't know. I think I have to do something because there is so much numbness. And then I feel bad that I'm not as upset about other things as I have been about this one. And so I don't know. The only options, neither of which is a biblical option, is bury my head in the sand and pretend like all the other stuff isn't happening, or just be exposed to all of it so that I don't feel anything when it happens. I don't know how best to do the middle. So if you figure it out, please. No, seriously, let us know. I need to know that too. It's really good. Yeah, Jay?
Honestly, and this I suppose is a little selfishly since I am a teacher, but one way is to reach out to your teacher friends because we are confronted by this stuff time and time and time again. Lockdown drills, and this hit really close to home as I had students who attended there, and we have angrier kids in our classrooms. We have broken families, and we didn't get time to grieve. I mean, it happened, and I kept teaching.
Yeah.
It happened, a student found out in my classroom who went there, and I have to.
Yeah.
And reach out to your teacher friends, because you might think it's just another news cycle, but then it's just another uptick in us having to check all our doors and check all our lockdown stuff and check everything and have meetings about that instead of confronting the things that are really necessary. And
Yeah.
Honestly, we did not get a chance to, I don't know how I'm feeling.
Yeah.
Haven't had a chance
Yeah.
to like
Yeah.
grieve or anything.
Yeah.
And it's one way to start helping is our education system is falling further and further because the teachers are just
Yeah.
so much is thrown on. This is a huge thing.
That's
Where
a
we
good
go to
word.
school every day worrying if I'm not. My Christian school's great, but so many of them
That's
worried
what they
if they're
would have
going to
thought
get
too.
well, yes, true. But worried if they're going to get attacked by students.
Totally.
Or worried if they're going to block everything.
Yeah. No, it's really, really hard. You're right. Yep. Good. Any other thoughts? Over here, would you wait for the microphone for us, just so people online can hear too?
Hey, I really appreciate what you're up to here, Mike, and love what's happening in this community.
Oh, we're trying.
No, it's a lovely, lovely thing. The day after the incident, we realized that young William was played in the same league as our son Ozzy, baseball league, and we went out to the field where they played the next day, and we're hanging ribbons out around the fence and on the backstop, and just to stand in solidarity with the family. And as Wendy and I were working through holding this grief and holding this hope and managing the flood of emotions there, we looked down and our son Axel had picked up a stick and was carving something into the dirt. And when he was done, he stood back and it just said love. Mm. And it was a profound moment for us, in particular because we didn't know what to do with these feelings, these emotions. But here is not an emotion that my son had at 10, 11 years old now, written there so innocently, but it was a call to action.
Yeah.
And I recalled something that was said in a church many years ago where he attended out of state, and the pastor said that you are the way that God happens on this planet. We are the way that God happens on this planet. And that kind of rhymes with what you were saying up there. And one of my favorite theologians, G.K. Chesterton, look him up if you don't know him. He has said some just dandy things, but one of them he has said is that the danger of prayer is that we think the work is already done.
They'll preach.
And this is a moment where we get to happen on this planet, not just pray and bless, whatever that may be, but how do we happen here?
Yeah.
And with respect to this question about hope and where is hope these days after eons, that it's happening. I believe that hope is happening on a more frequent level now, maybe than ever in history, on a microcosmic level, in individual lives, moments of grace, moments of power. And I think we are choosing differently as individuals. I see evidence of it. Even, sorry, I'll tear up at this, but I sat with someone this week who knew the Kuntz family, and she wasn't a victim like we're thinking of some of these kids as being victims. She was proactive. She went toward the shooter as the family understands it. And she laid down her life for her friends. Lives were saved because of her. And while the whole thing feels like tragedy, you move the camera in a little closer and something profoundly beautiful, something profoundly, literally life-giving happened in that moment. And yes, it's easy to see all the horror in the world, but we have to be careful what we choose to look at.
Yeah.
And I don't want to grow cynical. I teach my kids cynicism is the anti-prayer. Let's not fall into that hope. And anyway, I've been talking far too long, but thank you for this chance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, friends, here's what we're going to do. We just wanted to bear witness to each other in the midst of this, and that it's all welcome. It's all welcome. The anger, the sadness. The way, one of the only things we know to do in moments like this is as a community to remind ourselves of our mission in the world, to be broken and poured out for the sake of the nations. And for far too long, the church has prioritized its own self-protection and self-preservation. And there are moments when, as has been said multiple times, God's people can actually move with the authority that only the example of Christ gives. So we're going to take communion together. We'll have people at the sides of the rooms that will just offer it so that there's a human voice. And there's people also willing to pray if you just want someone to pray. But we're going to sing songs of lament. We're going to have just a few moments of instrumental music to be just however we are. And then we'll sing songs of lament and hope and celebrate communion together. So, Father, I shift between anger and sadness and numbness minute by minute. And Lord, we can only imagine the churches that are seeking to bear witness to the risen Jesus today, where families who've been directly affected by this attend. And we cannot imagine the incredible grief of families that have lost children or parents or spouses, brothers or sisters. And so, Lord, we call upon you. We lament this before you. We ask, God, that you would examine our ways and test us so that if there are ways in which we've contributed to the mess, that we would walk in repentance. And Lord, would you unify us around the table, the body and blood poured out for us, that we in turn are invited to pour out for each other. So to that end, we ask your blessing and presence. Amen.